Hi, I'm Bret Champion, Superintendent of Schools here in the Medford School District. We started the book No Talking, and today we're going to pick up where we left off last time. No Talking. Thank you to the Jacksonville Elementary Library for letting me borrow this book. Chapter 8, Science Fiction. It was 4 minutes into the fifth grade lunch period, and Mrs. Hyatt was pretty sure that any second now her alarm clock was going to start making that awful sound, brap, 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 because the principal was almost certain that she was still at home in her own comfy bed, dreaming away. She had to be dreaming. But no, she looked at her watch, and it showed the same time as the large clock above the stage in the school cafeteria, 12:04. On any other day, Mrs. Hyatt would have already used her bullhorn at least once, because when half the fifth graders were standing in the food line and the other half were in the milk line or rushing toward their seats, there was always a terrific burst of yelling and calling out and wild chatter, sort of like feeding time at the zoo. But not today. There was no talking at all, not one word. Over 125 children milling around the lunchroom and not a peep from any of them. Today, the principal could hear the clattering of the worn-out motor in the milk cooler, and she could hear the kitchen workers talking softly to each other, and she could hear the children's feet on the tile floor shuffling along through the lines. The quiet almost frightened her. Mrs. Hyatt felt like she was in a scene from a creepy science fiction movie. She actually liked a good scary movie now and then, but she did not like the ideas in her mind at this moment, because it seemed like aliens had possessed these fifth graders and zapped their brains, or maybe some strange creature had nipped off all their tongues, nothing left but little stubs that couldn't make a sound. The principal shivered. Then she noticed a girl staring at her. Mrs. Hyatt realized she must have had a strange look on her face. As the girl sat down with her lunch tray, Mrs. Hyatt forced herself to smile and said, "Hi there, Sheila. How are you today?" Her voice almost echoed in the quiet lunchroom. Every boy in the milk line turned and stared at Sheila. The girls turned and looked too. Sheila gulped, gave the principal a nervous smile, and speaking softly and slowly, she said, "Fine, thank you." Mrs. Hyatt turned toward the milk line, and all the kids looked away, silently. And again, the principal felt like she was in the middle of a science fiction movie. It suddenly seemed silly to be standing there in a silent room with her huge red plastic bullhorn. So Mrs. Hyatt walked over to the playground door where Mrs. Escobar was standing. She tried to look as casual as possible, tried to act like it was perfectly normal for the lunchroom to be stone silent except for the clattering of plates and the squeaking of sneakers on the waxed floor. The principal set the bullhorn on the floor by the wall and whispered to Mrs. Escobar, "What in the world is going on here?" Mrs. Escobar whispered back, "I have no idea, but it's something weird, that's for sure." Mrs. Hyatt did not like this feeling that something strange, something new was happening, because this new activity was happening at her school, and no one had asked for her permission. This new activity was unauthorized. Mrs. Hyatt didn't simply like being in charge of her own school. She felt like she needed to be in charge, and that's why she felt like she had to say something, do something to break the spell. So she stepped away from the wall, and in a loud voice, she said, "Good afternoon, fifth graders. Are you enjoying your lunchtime today?" All the kids looked at each other. The whole room seemed to take a deep breath, and then almost everyone said, "Yes, Mrs. Hyatt," and then silence again. After an awkward few seconds, the principal said, "It's so quiet in here today. I'm very impressed with your good behavior." Some kids smiled, some nodded, but no one said a word. Mrs. Hyatt said, "Is there some special reason why no one's talking today?" The whole room went still. Even the chewing stopped. No hands went up and no one answered her question. But Mrs. Hyatt was a keen observer, and in that sudden stillness, she noticed something. Right after she asked her question, it seemed like almost every boy looked at Dave Packer, who was standing beside the milk cooler. And it seemed like almost every girl took a quick look at Lindsay Burgess, who was just sitting down at a table. And the principal thought, "That's odd." But the whole situation was odd, very odd, and now it seemed like the room was stuck in a complete calm, as if all the kids had stopped breathing. Everyone was waiting to see what she was going to do next. After a few more seconds of suspense, Mrs. Hyatt cleared her throat and said, "Well, students, please enjoy the rest of your lunchtime." And the cafeteria came back to life, silently. Chapter 9, The Right Word. As Dave sat down at a lunch table with his friends, he couldn't get the grin off his face. He was having so much fun, he could hardly chew his first bite of grilled cheese. And he didn't like chewing right now because chewing made noise, and when he munched, he couldn't hear the silence. The silence! Dave thought it was amazing. And watching Mrs. Hyatt try to figure out what was going on, that was amazing too. It was like they had trapped her in a force field, and she couldn't get out of it because the silence filled the cafeteria. Dave looked around and he saw the same amazement on the faces of some other kids. They were all thinking about the same thing together. Then suddenly, "Hey, give it back!" There was a gasp as every boy and girl in the room sucked in a breath, and all heads turned to see where those words had come from. And there at the ice cream freezer, Ed Kesey had one hand over his mouth, while his other hand reached for a cherry popsicle that Brian Del Greco had grabbed. Dave swung around and looked at Lindsay. Lindsay knew a lot of kids were watching her, but she pretended not to notice. She slowly reached into her back pocket, slowly pulled out a pen and a small red notebook, slowly opened the cover, and slowly made 4 little marks on the first page. And as she flipped the notebook shut, Lindsay looked right at Dave and gave him a big smile. Just like that, and the girls were ahead by 4 points. But Dave wasn't worried. The contest had barely begun. There were 2 whole days to go. Dave was absolutely sure that the next 48 hours were going to be very interesting. And he thought, is that the right word? How about fascinating? No, more like exciting. Yeah, exciting. Then Dave happened to glance at Mrs. Hyatt, and he could tell from the look on the principal's face that she had been watching everything. The way Ed had shouted those words and then covered his mouth, the way all the other kids had reacted, the way Lindsay had marked her notebook. And at that exact moment, the principal turned and locked eyes with Dave. She stared right at him, with her eyebrows all bunched up in a puzzled knot. Dave quickly looked down at his lunch tray, and as he did, a new word popped into his mind, and he was pretty sure this one was also going to be a good word to describe the next few days. Dangerous. Chapter 10, Recess. Mrs. Marlowe was a 5th grade science teacher, and it was her day for outdoor recess duty. As she was gulping down a quick lunch in the teacher's room, Mr. Lipton, the custodian, stuck his head in the door and said, "Anybody want to see a miracle? Go check out the cafeteria. The 5th graders aren't talking today, not even whispering. It's like a funeral in there." But Mrs. Marlowe didn't have a moment to spare. She finished her lunch, grabbed her coat, and hurried outside to the playground through the gym. Even without the heads up from the custodian, it wouldn't have taken her long to figure out that something was different at outside recess today. Every teacher knows the sound of a normal, happy playground at lunchtime. Kids talking and yelling and chasing and all the arguments about who's it and who's out and who ran faster. Not today. Mrs. Marlowe could tell a whole layer of spoken sound was missing. Gone. Absent. Except not completely. Because the kids did make some slip-ups during their first wordless recess. Allie Bedford got caught whispering to Lena Henderson by the swing set, and when a group of boys stood and shook their fingers at her, she held up 8 fingers to show how many illegal words she had said. Christina Farley didn't have to confess because half the kids on the playground heard exactly what she said loud and clear. She stomped her feet, stuck out her tongue at Rachel Morgan, and then shouted, "You're a terrible friend, and you lie, and you're selfish, and I don't care how many words this is, and you're mean, too," which was 23 words. Christina's goof, plus the 8 words Allie whispered, meant that Dave got to record 31 points against the girls on his official score sheet, which wasn't as fancy as Lindsay's red notebook, just a couple of folded index cards stuffed in his pocket. But the boys weren't perfect either. Scott Vickers booted a kickball down the third base line, and when 2 boys made the foul ball motion, he yelled, "Foul? Are you crazy? No way. That ball was fair." And Scott would have kept on yelling, but Bill Harkness tackled him and clamped a hand over his mouth, which Scott bit, but not hard enough to make Bill yell any words. That incident cost the boys 10 points. And then there was the first case of trickery. Katie Edison snuck up behind Jeremy Stevens, who was standing by the sliding board, tapped him on the shoulder, and when he turned his head, she gave him a big, noisy kiss on the cheek. Jeremy howled and wiped his face and flew into a fit of cootieitis. "Ooh, yuck! Why did you do that? That was so gross! Yuck! Help me get this stuff off my face!" Which was 20 more points for the girls. Plus, Katie actually enjoyed her sneak attack. She had had a top-secret crush on Jeremy for 2 months. Even though there were only a few word blasts, it certainly wasn't quiet out there, and it got noisier and noisier as the end of recess got closer. That's because everyone began to realize that this was not a contest to see who could be silent. It was just about not talking. Sounds were allowed, as long as they weren't words. Dave was near the door of the gym and began whistling. He was instantly joined by 4 other boys. They whistled every song they could think of. "Row, row, row your boat," "Now I Know My ABCs," "London Bridge is Falling Down," Barney's Marching Song, the Star Wars theme song, "Old MacDonald Had a Farm," "I've Been Working on the Railroad," "Rubber Ducky," on and on. The whistling was mostly off key, but it was a grand performance anyway, with lots of clapping and hooting between tunes. Somewhere near the middle of the whistling concert, 6 or 7 girls began screaming. These were not the kind of screams that make grown-ups come running. They were just an ugly assortment of squeals and yelps and shrieks that everyone else found very annoying. Spaced out around the edge of the playground, the girls bounced their high-pitched sounds around like a beach ball at a baseball stadium. Yow, ooh-wee, woohoo, yee-yee-yee. They made lots of noise, but they weren't talking. Some other girls were jumping double dutch, and since they couldn't chant the rhymes, the kids who weren't jumping or turning the ropes clapped out the rhythm of the words with their hands. The quietest activity involved 4 girls who had a printed folder that showed how to use American Sign Language. They sat in a circle on the ground and practiced their hand signals. And to round out the soundscape, Bradley Lang and Tyler Rennert were cruising around the playground, bothering as many girls as possible by making all sorts of mouth sounds: clicks, pops, roars, quacks, barks, burps, and especially those loud bathroom noises created by puffing the palms of both hands over the mouth, puffing up the cheeks, and blooping out a blast of air. Mrs. Marlowe could see there was plenty of activity, but those high-pitched playground voices, all that buzz and chatter and calling out, all that was definitely missing. There was no mistaking it. These kids were not talking, which would have been unusual for any bunch of students. For this group of kids, the custodian had called it right. It was practically a miracle. But why? There had to be a reason they were all acting this way. And as a science-minded person, Mrs. Marlowe was curious. So as she stood there thinking, Mrs. Marlowe began to adjust her afternoon lesson plan. Because in about 10 minutes, 26 of those 5th graders would be sitting in her room ready for science class. And there was nothing Mrs. Marlowe liked better than a good experiment. Chapter 11, Questions and Answers. In all her years of teaching, 17 in total, Mrs. Marlowe had never walked into a quieter classroom full of students. It was a new experience for her. It was also new for the kids. Dave watched Mrs. Marlowe go to the front of the room and pick up her attendance book. The teacher looked at the list of names in the book, looked up and down the rows of the class, looked at the book again, and said, "I thought maybe I was in the wrong room. Pretty quiet in here today. Can someone tell me why?" No hands went up. But Mrs. Marlowe was watching for anything that might give her a clue about this unusual behavior. And after her question, she saw a few sly glances between kids, and she noticed some of them trying to hide a smile. She knew that what these looks and smiles meant. These kids were keeping a secret. Time for her first experiment. Looking over the class, Mrs. Marlowe settled her eyes on Seth Townsend, smiled, and said, "So, Seth, did you do your science homework last night?" With no hesitation, Seth smiled back and said, "Yes, I did." Mrs. Marlowe looked at Amy Gilson and said, "How about you, Amy?" She nodded and said, "It was hard." "Really? What did you think was hard about it?" she asked. Amy scrunched up her face and then said, "Too much math." Her answer got a lot of nods and a few laughs from the other kids, but then it went completely quiet again. Mrs. Marlowe couldn't get over how beautifully these children were behaving. Just yesterday, she had asked one student a question, and about 15 others had blurted out answers. Then the whole class began arguing, and that had started a huge free-for-all that didn't end until she banged on her desk with a book. It was always like that with this class, and with the other 5th grade classes too. But not today. No one talked at all, unless she asked a question, which gave Mrs. Marlowe an idea. "Please get out your homework sheets." There was a lot of rustling and bustling as the students obeyed. "Now," she said, "Ellen, look at problem number 1. How did you decide if the given quantities were reasonable?" Ellen riffled through her papers, and the look on her face surprised Mrs. Marlowe. Ellen looked scared. It was one of the standard questions about science problems, a question the whole class was used to, but the girls seemed completely confused. Mrs. Marlowe could see that she had done the assignment. Plus, Ellen was one of her best science students. What was she so scared about? After a few moments of what looked like absolute panic, Ellen calmed down. Then, very slowly, she said, "The numbers worked." Mrs. Marlowe waited for the rest of her explanation. It didn't come. "Right," she said, "and I made estimates," Ellen said. Again, her words came slowly, and then there was another long pause. "And," the teacher urged, "I used math." Mrs. Marlowe nodded. "Of course you used math, but I want to hear about your process, your thinking." Ellen said, "I did comparing." Frustrated, Mrs. Marlowe turned to the other side of the room. "Dave, tell us the answer you got for problem 1 and explain your process." Dave didn't look scared, but he also took a long time to respond. Too long for Mrs. Marlowe. She said, "I'd like your answer today, Mr. Packer." Slowly, Dave said, 440. 440 what?" prompted Mrs. Marlowe. "Barrels of oil," said Dave, slowly. Said Mrs. Marlowe. Dave said, "Per day." "Wrong," said Mrs. Marlowe. "Look at your work and tell me what you forgot." She was losing her patience. Dave frowned and squinted at his paper. He nodded and then slowly said, the first day. A ripple of giggles swept through the room. Girl giggles. Mrs. Marlowe snapped, "Since when did wrong answers become funny?" The science teacher thought, "Are they all pretending to be stupid today? Is that it?" Whatever was going on, she didn't like it. It was disruptive. It was slowing down her class. It was annoying. And suddenly, Mrs. Marlowe was in no mood for games. She was not going to play along. If these kids wanted quiet, then that's what they were going to get. She glared around the room. "Pass in your papers." Everyone obeyed without a word. "Open to chapter 4 and read. The homework is on the board." The next 34 minutes in the science room passed in complete silence, except for the rustle of paper and an occasional cough or sniffle. And sitting at her desk, Mrs. Marlowe had to admit that she enjoyed the quiet, enjoyed not having to fight the battle of the mouth every second with these kids. The unshushables were completely shushed, all right. Very weird. But the science teacher wasn't any closer to figuring out why the kids were acting this way. Dave felt something hit his arm and then drop onto his leg. It was a note. He glanced at Mrs. Marlowe. All clear. So he slowly reached down, picked up the note, and unfolded it. "You said, the first day. Counts as a word. So you said 4, and you cost the boys 1 whole point. Loser. Ha ha, Lindsay." Dave knew Lindsay was sitting 2 seats back on his left, and he knew she was waiting for him to turn around so she could give him a sickly sweet little smile. So he didn't turn around, but he felt the tops of his ears getting pink, and he began thinking of a million things he wished he could say to her. All sorts of clever insults like, "If brains were money, you'd be broke," or "Wow, you can count to 4," or "I had a pet turtle that..." "Mr. Packer, bring it here." Dave snapped to attention and looked up to see Mrs. Marlowe staring at him, holding out her hand. Putting on his best innocent face, Dave said, "What?" "The note. Here." As Dave walked up and dropped the note into Mrs. Marlowe's hand, the bell rang. Mrs. Marlowe tucked the paper into her pocket and then stood up quickly, because when the bell rang, she had to hurry out her door and try to maintain law and order in the hallway between classes. But of course, there was no need for the corridor police, not today. Mrs. Marlowe watched all the 5th graders move from room to room, smiling, waving, making faces, nodding at each other. There were a few laughs and whistles, and then she heard Tyler Rennard make a loud snort in the general direction of some girls, but there was no talking. She looked across the hall and caught Mrs. Escobar's eye, and they both smiled and then shrugged at each other. And since there wasn't any patrol work to do, Mrs. Marlowe reached into her pocket and pulled out the captured note, and she read it. For a logical person like Mrs. Marlowe, Lindsay's note to Dave was like the Rosetta Stone, a key that helped her begin to understand what she had seen and heard on the playground and then in her classroom. So, this whole thing was something about counting words. More than 3 words resulted in a penalty, which explained all those short answers from Ellen and Dave. And it was the boys against the girls. Nothing new about that, not with this group. And they were all trying to keep quiet. Mrs. Marlowe remembered the Jinx game from her own school years, when 2 people said the same word at the same time and they had to keep quiet. Maybe it was like that. Except this wasn't 2 people. It was more than 125 of the most talkative children on planet Earth. As chunks of the puzzle began to fall into place, Mrs. Marlowe immediately thought, "The others are going to love this." She meant the other teachers. But then her scientific curiosity kicked in and she thought, "Why spoil the kids' experiment? And I should really let the other teachers figure things out on their own. And of course, my preliminary findings could be wrong. I should certainly gather more data before I present my theory to the scholarly community." And as Mrs. Marlowe chuckled at her private joke, she said to herself, "Kids." Chapter 12, Guessing Games. Tuesday afternoon in the 5th grade hall was a challenge for everyone. Mrs. Akers walked into the music room, sat at her piano, smiled, and said, "My, you are all behaving so well this afternoon. Wonderful. Now please open your songbooks to 'This Land Is Your Land.'" And she played the introduction on the piano. She said, "Back straight, big smiles, deep breaths, and..." No one sang. The piano stopped mid-measure, and Mrs. Akers frowned at the class. "Now I know you can all do better than that." She began the introduction again, counting in the beats. 1 and 2 and 3. "This land is your land, this land..." Mrs. Akers stopped. She was singing a solo, and her high, quivering voice made the kids giggle. She frowned again. "All right, students, this is not funny, and it's not good. We have less than 2 weeks before our Thanksgiving program, and we have no time for this kind of silliness." She pointed a bright pink fingernail around the room. "Brian, Tommy, Anna, every one of you, I want to hear you sing." She banged out the introduction again, and the whole class sang, "This land is," and then stopped. The piano kept playing, and Mrs. Akers bellowed, "Sing!" And most of the kids jumped in on, my land from, and then stopped. After another shouted command, they sang, the redwood forest, and that's how the whole song went, chopped up into 3-word bits. And when Mrs. Akers, her face bright red by this point, thumped on her piano and said, what is wrong with all of you today? The kids didn't say a word. Like all teachers, Mrs. Akers understood the divide and conquer rule. When you need to get to the bottom of something, you don't ask the whole class, you ask one student. So she pointed at Lena in the front row and said, why aren't you singing? Lena hesitated, then motioned at the kids all around the room and said, not talking today. Mrs. Akers said, what's that supposed to mean? Not talking. Lena nodded. Only 3 words. The music teacher was even more puzzled. She pointed at James and said, explain. James had trouble expressing himself even under the best conditions. He gulped and took a deep breath. Then he said, not words, everyone. A light dawned on Mrs. Akers' face. And still talking to James, she said, oh, so is it like that project kids do when they take a vow of silence to protest how there's still slavery in Africa? I read about that. Is that it? James looked lost. He shook his head. Hard explain. Not. But Mrs. Akers felt like she had answered the riddle, or maybe partly answered it. And whatever was happening, she decided to be a good sport. Looking around the room, she said, so tell me, can you all hum? Is humming allowed? Everyone grinned and nodded like maniacs. How about clapping? Can you clap in rhythm? More smiles and nods. All right then, here we go again. And she ripped back into the piano. 1 and 2 and 3. And 24 fifth graders clapped and hummed along as Mrs. Akers played all 7 verses of This Land Is Your Land. Then the whole class giggled and laughed and hummed and clapped their way through the other 4 songs on the Thanksgiving program. And they all survived their first wordless music class. The 5th period gym class was less dramatic than music. News had gotten to most of the teachers that the 5th graders had gone quiet, which didn't bother the gym teacher at all. Tuesday was dodgeball day, so Mrs. Henley appointed the 2 captains, and then the captains picked their teams by pointing, and the first game got underway, all without a word. Dodgeball, which can be pretty serious anyway, seemed especially grim without the talking and shouting. Then there were the usual grunts of effort and screams of terror, and when 3 or 4 kids with red dodgeballs would silently go hunting for one player on the other team, it was sort of like watching a pack of wolves go after a lone caribou. A motion of the leader's head, a movement toward the prey, and then whack, whack, whomp, dead meat. From the gym teacher's point of view, dodgeball was all about improving reflexes and getting a good, large motor skills workout. To accomplish those goals without any of the taunting and teasing and name-calling, that was just fine by her. Even so, Mrs. Henley watched all 3 games with great interest, and she saw how the kids communicated without words, and she noticed herself pointing and shaking her head and blowing her whistle instead of yelling. It was nice to give her voice a rest. Mr. Burton taught 5th grade reading and language arts. He was puzzled at the beginning of the class right after lunch, and like the music teacher and the science teacher, he asked questions and got 3-word answers. But he kept at it, and after about 5 minutes, he figured out what was going on, at least part of it. Unlike Mrs. Marlowe, Mr. Burton had a lot of patience and a pretty good sense of humor, and he couldn't see any real problem with having these kids be this well behaved. Anything that got the unshushable quiet was fine by him. Plus, he decided they could all have some fun with this limit of 3 words in a row. He picked a funny story from their reading textbook, a really short one, and he had the kids read it out loud, 3 words each, and as fast as possible, with him calling out the name of the next narrator. And when the story was finished, he said, okay, now I want you to make up a story. He picked up a meter stick and said, when I point at you, say a 3-word sentence, and listen carefully so you can make the story move forward. Here we go. The story started like this. A woman screamed. She was scared. It was dark. Oh no, snakes! One bit her. Ow, my leg! She limped outside. Her neighbor came. What's wrong? Snakes are everywhere. Are they poisonous? Yeah, and smelly. Quick, my car! You saved me! Darn, dead battery. Round and round the room the story went. The poor woman and her neighbor were eventually eaten by the huge orange lizards that came up out of the sewers and ripped the roof off the car. The lizards also ate all the snakes. But then some ugly tulips in the garden grew razor blade teeth and ate the lizards. And then the tulips burped giant burps, which created a tornado that made the Statue of Liberty fall over and crush a tugboat, which made a wave that washed all the way to the White House and got muddy water all over the president's polka-dotted underpants. It was quite a tale. The period ended, and as the students walked quietly out of the room, Mr. Burton got a lot of waves and smiles and thumbs up, and he waved and smiled back at the kids. No words were needed. It had been a successful class, fun, creative, lively, and everyone had used their word skills in new ways. Mr. Burton felt great. The next 40 minutes was his planning period, and then came the last class of the day, period 7. He had some papers to grade, but Mr. Burton was too excited because what these kids were doing, well, it felt like a once-in-a-lifetime chance to mess around with words and language and communication, to try something fresh, something special. After all, science teachers aren't the only people who like a good experiment. So Mr. Burton sat at his desk, thinking and thinking. Finally, with about 2 minutes before period 7, he got it. A great idea. Plus, he realized that this situation could be useful to him in a totally unexpected way. And as the bell rang, Mr. Burton noticed that he was actually looking forward to his last class of the afternoon. Another proof that this was not an ordinary day. Chapter 13, Language Lab. As his last class of the day came into Mr. Burton's room, he didn't speak, and of course, neither did the students. The bell rang, and all the kids watched him as he put a stack of lined paper on the front desk of each row. Then he turned to the chalkboard and began to write. Today there will be writing only. Nothing will be turned in, but everyone must write all period long, and everyone must communicate with at least 4 other people. You may not stop writing for more than 15 seconds. As soon as you have paper, begin. In less than 1 minute, every kid had paper, and in less than 2 minutes, the first notes were changing hands. Todd wrote, "I still think this no talking thing is stupid," and he passed the paper to Kyle. Kyle read the note and wrote, "I sort of like it. It's different, a challenge." And then Todd wrote, "Challenge? What challenge? The teachers already know about it. Like Mr. Burton. He's just messing with us. Thinks it's great we're not talking. I like talking." Kyle read, and he wrote back, "Too bad. Think how hard it is for all the blabby girls. We're going to win this contest. Beat the girls, beat the girls, beat the girls. Get it? It's a silent cheer, like at a basketball game. Cool, huh?" Todd wrote back, "Cool. Dude, it's lame. Here's my silent cheer. Kyle's a dork, Kyle's a dork, Kyle's a dork." Kyle read the note and made a face at Todd, and then turned his back on him and started up a chat with Eric. No talking made it very simple to tune someone out. A few seats away, Emily was having a hot argument with Taryn. "I did not say you couldn't come over after school. I just said, what's the point if we can't talk? That's all." Taryn read the note, shook her head, and wrote, "I know you don't like me as much as you like Kelly, so stop pretending." Emily rolled her eyes and wrote, "Don't be like that." Taryn shrugged and wrote, "Like what?" Emily used block letters for emphasis. "All sniffy and snoofy and ouchy. I hate that." "See," Taryn wrote, "hate. That's what you said. You hate me." Emily scribbled, "Don't be an idiot. I don't hate you. Come over after school, really. We'll think of something to do, but we're gonna want to talk. I know we will, and we can't." And Taryn wrote back, "I'm not coming. You think I'm an idiot." Emily read that, then ripped the paper to pieces. Then she reached across the aisle and patted Taryn on the arm and smiled her warmest smile, and then wrote on a fresh sheet of paper, "After school, my house, okay?" Taryn smiled back and nodded. All around the room, kids were having to figure out the new rules for communicating. And for most of them, writing was a lot harder than talking. It was slower, like instant messaging, only less instant and less fun because there was no computer to mess with. There was so much less give and take than there was with talking. The unshushables weren't used to that at all. Dave had just finished a frustrating set of back and forth messages with Bill. Bill couldn't understand how to keep from getting called offside during a soccer game. Dave had explained it 3 different ways. He had drawn pictures and diagrams and everything, and Bill still couldn't figure it out. So Dave passed a note to Ed because he was the best junior league player in town. "Bill doesn't get the offside rule. Help!" Ed read the note, nodded at Bill, bent over his paper, and began writing. Dave looked around for a new partner, and he saw that Lindsay was passing notes with Helena. They seemed to be having a great time, nodding a lot and cracking each other up. Probably gossiping, he thought, about something really stupid. He grabbed a clean sheet of paper and began a note to Lindsay. "What's the difference between you and a toxic waste dump?" But he decided that riddle was too harsh, even for Lindsay, even if it was true. He crumpled the paper and took another sheet. But before he started writing, he got up, walked to a bookcase, and grabbed a dictionary. He flipped the pages and then ran his fingers down a column of words. And there it was. Also. Interjection, used to express doubt or uncertainty or to fill a pause when hesitating in speaking. So Lindsay had been right about something for once. Hey, thanks for watching this version of reading the book No Talking, the excellent book by Andrew Clements. Andrew Clements is a fantastic author. Check him out. He's written a lot of terrific books. We'll pick up where we left off tomorrow. See you then.